Hi, my name is Sean Barrett. I am a principal analyst with the Risk Analysis and Mitigation Department, otherwise known as the RAM Group. Today, I am going to briefly discuss how addressing risk is linked to the creation of internal controls. I'm going to start out with how verified internal controls are part of the Compliance Oversight Plan development. Then we will briefly discuss elements of a strong risk assessment program, and I'll close out with how a risk assessment program can facilitate development of internal controls. This will be a high-level overview, as I could spend hours discussing any one of these slides. ReliabilityFirst reviews various inputs into an entity's inherent risk assessment, which are used to create an entity's compliance oversight plan. An entity's risk assessment consists of 18 risk factors and 7 performance considerations. Results of their analysis culminate in the risk categories identified in the Compliance Oversight Plan. The risk factors indicate entity-specific risks, and the performance considerations are a starting point in an entity's risk assessment. The results are used for our compliance monitoring oversight activities. Internal controls are one of the risk categories used in the assessment of an entity's risk performance. ReliabilityFirst assesses an entity's verified internal controls and its program, if provided, from multiple sources. For example, when the compliance monitoring team performs an audit of an entity, one of the areas that they look at is the internal controls regarding a specific set of standards. The RAM team reviews the report and uses that data as part of its analysis. To continue this example, RAM also reviews the evidence submitted regarding internal controls that an entity has created, revised, or completely replaced with a new internal control as part of their mitigation activities. Lastly, if the entity has provided its overall internal controls program to ReliabilityFirst for review, the RAM staff may have an opportunity to make a qualified assessment of the program. An assessment of the internal controls aids in identifying entity-specific risk areas and scope. It also is a factor into determining the entity's oversight strategy. Where do you start? By assessing the risk associated with your people, processes, and technology. Who are the people who are designing, implementing, and performing tasks associated with any given activity? Have internal controls been included? Has the implementation been verified? And most importantly, are the people performing the tasks adequately resourced, trained, and supported? Review current processes, both documented and undocumented, for areas of potential improvement. Obviously, you should document those areas that are not well documented in the first place. But also, the documented areas, are they sufficiently documented? Can somebody outside of that task come in and do the work based solely on the documentation? Are the processes routinely reviewed for accuracy and improvements? And lastly, assess the technology that you have, as well as the technology that you can deploy to address related issues. How has the technology's capabilities been leveraged to mitigate risk? Have technical prevention and detection controls been tested? Are all of your internal controls periodically reviewed? Building a comprehensive risk assessment program requires at least 5 key considerations. It must have a process that facilitates continuous improvement. For example, every entity should be performing an annual review of all of its processes to ensure that the processes are doing what they are supposed to be doing by the personnel that are performing the tasks. The program needs to be both holistic and comprehensive. Entities need to consider how all aspects of their programs are interrelated and how each one impacts others. The program should be implemented in a consistent and accurate manner. It should be dynamic enough that it can be adjusted as conditions change. And it needs to be documented. Again, tribal knowledge that exists with your current staff is a wonderful source of information, but employee turnover will occur. One of the greatest challenges of any organization is documenting their tribal knowledge. What are you assessing for? Keep in mind a comprehensive risk program evaluates all your vulnerabilities, assesses the threats to each one, and determines the potential damage that can be inflicted. Entities should be doing this on an annual basis. Vulnerabilities are weaknesses or gaps in a security program that can be exploited by threats to gain unauthorized access to an asset. Every company should be finding new or existing vulnerabilities that need further mitigation. Threats are anything that can exploit a vulnerability, intentionally or accidentally, and obtain, damage, or destroy an asset. Don't forget to assess your internal threats. Potential harm. If a threat can exploit a vulnerability, what can they do? Do not underestimate the potential harm. Many companies will limit the potential harm to a single system or device without considering that the device is interconnected. For instance, a compromise of a PCA in a control center not only threatens the loss of that system, but also could result in a compromise of the entire control system. Risk is always assessed using some version of probability or likelihood of occurrence times the impact or potential harm. When assessing probability of failure, you need to assess everything that interacts with the vulnerability to understand how it can be exploited by the threats. When determining the potential harm, look beyond the obvious. Assess what a threat would have to accomplish to impact other assets. We've listed a few examples to consider, but in the end, you must think like an attacker if you're assessing an intentional threat. Or consider how a SME may unintentionally impact your systems negatively through their actions. For instance, how experienced are the SMEs? Are they newly assigned and newly trained? That may increase the probability of occurrence. What is the worst that can happen if the SME doesn't do the task properly? Is a patch left open? Is a vulnerability exposed? What happens to that system if that vulnerability is leveraged by a malicious actor? What other systems could be impacted by that? There are two basic methods that can be used to assess risk: qualitative and quantitative. A qualitative risk assessment is the quickest, easiest, and most abstract. One of its purposes is to identify those risks that may need a more detailed analysis. Another use is when there is incomplete information required to perform a more detailed analysis. Entities should generally perform a qualitative analysis first to help determine if a more detailed analysis is even required based on the initial risk. One of the most effective qualitative assessments relies on the use of a risk matrix with guidelines, such as the example in the lower left corner. These are typically two-dimensional with the potential harm along one axis and the likelihood of occurrence along the other axis. If a more detailed analysis is required, then entities should perform a quantitative assessment. Quantitative risk assessments involve a detailed analysis of the systems involved. There are several different methodologies available, but they all rely on large amounts of qualified data and deep analysis. A few of the more common methods include, but are not limited to, fault tree analysis, decision tree analysis, and Monte Carlo analysis. The example shown in the lower right corner is a fault tree analysis. It uses a structured diagram which identifies elements that can cause system failures. Once you've completed your risk assessments and prioritized the risks, then it is time to look for ways to prevent and detect failures. Use the vulnerabilities to develop your internal controls. Once the controls are in place, you need to test them. You need to ensure that your internal controls are accomplishing the goal that they were designed to. Try to break the process. Test for your failures and measure your results. I can't emphasize enough that you really need to try to break the process. Figure out where the internal controls can actually fail. You need to evaluate both your failures and your near misses to make improvements. Sometimes an extent of condition will really help you understand where things are not functioning properly. Naturally, your root cause analysis is absolutely critical, because if you don't know why something's failing, you can't really fix it. Remediation corrects all the non-compliance and failures that you may have. That is an important step that we at RAM always require you to complete when you're doing a mitigation plan for a self-report. Corrective actions address those internal controls, and preventive actions create additional controls that help prevent the problems from occurring in the future. Again, you must test your internal controls because they fail for a variety of reasons. So why do they fail? If you're familiar with the NERC cause code flowchart, you know it's essentially a comprehensive list of how things fail. It can be a useful tool, but most failures can be sorted into about a dozen buckets. Some of my favorites are listed here. People. Actual human error occurs mostly due to a failure to pay attention to the details or the task that someone is working on. Often this is because they are actually overwhelmed due to inadequate resources. Sometimes entities will cite human performance when it is actually a process deficiency, poor documentation, poor training, or some other root cause. This may be due to weaker internal controls. Process deficiencies often occur when the process is insufficiently documented. For instance, it could be a process that an experienced SME does well because they know all of the undocumented steps to take when something unusual happens. However, their backup may not be as knowledgeable and cause an issue. Poor communication often occurs when there are staff handoffs due to vacations, job changes, and employee turnovers. During these events, critical tasks still must be accomplished, and it's important that a coordination occurs. Poor coordination can result in breakdowns. Poor change management is normally an issue when the unexpected occurs. Nearly every company has good processes when things work well, but when they don't, this is where they usually have issues. For instance, a patch is installed on 10 systems, but one of them has an odd event that delays the process. This odd event breaks their change management process and results in some kind of reportable issue. Technology and equipment failures often occur with little warning. While entities have limited control of the failure itself, they do have control in their response. Having well-documented contingency plans help mitigate these rare events. Design failures can occur in any process or technology that does not identify and mitigate some common issues. The best mitigation to design failures is thorough testing. As mentioned previously, really trying to break a system is the best way to find its weaknesses. Poor training can be an issue for a variety of reasons. Often a training program may be insufficient to ensure that people learn and retain the information. Another key reason may be that the training program doesn't provide enough information in that it fails to cover some common contingencies. Lastly, poor documentation. You've heard me mention tribal knowledge earlier. It's great when you have SMEs that are very proficient at their tasks, but SMEs retire, change positions, and they even go on vacation periodically. It is important that your documentation is thorough enough for someone else to be able to accomplish the tasks. My favorite test is to assign the task to someone with little knowledge of it and have them identify the weaknesses through their failures. Okay, once you've developed, documented, and implemented your internal controls, you're well on your way to being more resilient, reliable, and secure. But there is more to do. I'm talking about a continuous improvement program. A continuous improvement program is the most effective way to improve your internal controls. It should include these 5 components. You must support your internal controls through routine training and development. Review current documentation and implementation to verify they are accomplishing the desired goal. This should be done through monitoring as well as annual holistic analysis. Reviews need to ensure that changes in the environment result in appropriate changes in the controls, which is why they must be dynamic. Nothing stays stagnant. This is the end of this overview. As I mentioned at the beginning, I could talk for hours on any one of these slides. internal controls are an integral part of any company's business functions. They are also an important part of your performance considerations that the Risk Analysis Department considers in developing an entity's compliance oversight plan. I want to thank you for your interest in viewing this presentation. If you have any questions or want more information, you can locate the most current contact information on the ReliabilityFirst website. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.